Without further ado, I'm starting the stream. And 3, 2, 1. And we're live. I welcome the audience to this wonderful debate today. And without further ado, I welcome the first speaker from the affirmative side to start this debate. Here.
Cool. I'll just take POIs in the chat. Culture is not a commodity. Hawke's Bay cannot stand for the practice which sees Indigenous people and their traditions treated poorly for monetary gain. That reflects stereotypes that serves no practical purpose. We are so proud to affirm today's motion. Two things we stand for in the debate today. Firstly, we oppose governments taking Indigenous culture and placing it in campaigns to promote tourism. What does this look like? This looks like promoting rituals by featuring Indigenous people, mimicking what the government perceives as what their culture is like. We see this with having people from that culture engaging in cultural activities, which is seen by the West as being what that culture is like, i.e. having girls from Hawaii participating in the luau and things like that. Secondly, we stand for promoting Indigenous culture in a way that isn't for profit or monetary gain. This looks like incentives for the government to promote culture through actual beneficial means domestically and internationally. This looks like teaching Te Reo Māori in schools and doing things like that, and also having things like the haka at rugby games internationally, as this is seen as promoting international culture overseas. To win today's debate, we need to prove two things. Firstly, that promoting the culture is firstly harmful to the culture that it's promoting, and secondly, it's bad for the tourism industry of New Zealand as a whole. 3 points for the House today. Firstly, why tourists won't engage with Indigenous culture, and secondly, even if they do, how it's detrimental to the culture, and a split at Jack about how it's used to cover up government actions and reflects badly on the government. Right, so on to my first substantive. Before the substantive, I'd just like to give a little bit of setup here. Why is government representation of culture so bad? 3 reasons. Firstly, the government has historically oppressed these Indigenous groups. Secondly, when they're promoting this culture to a foreign market, they'll firstly simplify it so everyone can have access to it and everyone can recognize that culture. Or secondly, if they can't do that, they'll literally just change it in a way that will get the most amount of people seeing it. And thirdly, it highlights things people will care about in that culture in a negative way. We see this girls in Hawaii who are over sexualized in ad campaigns simply because that is what the majority of people want to see and expect to see. Right. After that, why won't tourists engage with the culture? Tourists have a number one priority is escapism. Their goal above all else is to literally just have a good time because that's what they're paying for. That's what all this accommodation is all about. Right. So 2 ways they don't engage. Firstly, it's because they go for the idea of the culture. They come for because they don't really need to know the nitty-gritty or the work it takes to actually recognize a culture. They see that culture promoted on an ad campaign by the government and they're like, oh, that looks cool. I better go do that. They are not going to be taking the actual work it is to recognize this culture because that takes away from the overall enjoyment, right? People are not going because they think they already know what the culture is. They think they are already educated enough to do that. Therefore, in their world, this looks like people doing culturally appropriating things, like wearing Māori clothing that isn't even in a very disrespectful way. In our world, we are already attracting those who already know about the culture and actually have an interest in getting and actually wanting to know more because we're not using it in a way for monetary gain only. Secondly, though, it takes time away from the relaxation of the tourists. Tourists don't want to take time away from their holiday to learn about culture when they're at that place, right? So therefore, because people are engaging in this sort of whitewashed culture only that they signed up for, they are going to be thoroughly disappointed when they go to that place and turns out the culture is like a lot different. They don't want to engage with the culture that like they didn't sign up for. They only want the whitewashed, the dumbed down version of said culture. On their side, this looks like them being like disappointed by the culture because it doesn't meet their unrealistic expectations. Therefore, they're less likely to come back and spend more money. Therefore, less money is going back into the New Zealand economy and everything like that. On our side, they can see aspects on culture on display in a way that's accessible to them. People admire the haka at New Zealand rugby games and internationally around the world. They think it is really engaging, and therefore those people are more likely to respect the culture in a way that's beneficial. Before I move on to my second conservative, I will take a POI.
Annually, Samoa, an Indigenous-run government, gets millions of dollars from marketing cultural experiences internationally, as there is no domestic market for these experiences. What would you do? Why do you stand for a massive harm that is stripping these communities of their primary sources of income?
Right, what we say there is that the money that's going to this government is not directly going back into these Indigenous communities that they're profiting off. If you will have to give like an explanation of how the money going into the government is actually going to help these Indigenous people for that point to really stand. Right, onto my second substantive about why this engagement will be harmful if it does occur. The image of the culture is bad, right? I've explained that. So it leads to tourists having an incorrect knowledge around what that culture is going to be. Three really negative ways this works. Firstly, they're going to misuse it. They're going to come thinking they know what they're doing, right? Because the government is telling them, hey, you know what a luau is, you know what Hawaiian people do. You can come to Hawaii and experience it for yourself. This is something that this is some incorrect preconceived biases that they have so that they know about this culture, right? In their world, they're less likely to actually listen to the Indigenous people because it's quite uncomfortable to be wrong. People don't want to be called out by Indigenous people hey, you're not doing this practice right, hey, you're not engaging in it right, because it's just simply we as humans don't like being told we're wrong, and therefore are more likely to believe the government who is telling us, yes, you are engaging in this culture correctly, because it reaffirms our already knowledge, right? An example of this is the luau ceremony in Hawaii, which is incredibly sacred. Indigenous people have said this, yet it is still marketed all over the world and people still partake in it incorrectly. On our side, we reduce this market completely, right? When we don't have these people coming with their incorrect knowledge, therefore there's no money, when they do not come, there is no money going into the tourism sector. Therefore, these people at the moment have to actively change their practices and stop using these bad practices and actually adapt to a more economic, viable way of tourism. We believe that is so important because we are that's important because it's better for the Indigenous communities overall, and they can find an ulterior way to profit. On their side, right, they're just allowing this disrespect to prevail without any consequences. Second mechanism, though, is that the tourists who this marketing actually does attract does not care about the culture. When they get there and these people are engaging, they take it as its most tokenistic level. They basically boil down Hawaiian culture to just plastic leis, which reinforces stereotypes because they just simply don't know. And they think that's all what the culture is. They think that's such a basic level. In our world, we dismantle these stereotypes through education. That is so important because when we have a more educated tourism base, we have more people who will treat it with the respect that it deserves. Right. Lastly, about how landmarks are more likely to be destroyed under our side of the house. Tourists are ignorant, especially in cases of disruptive people. People are more likely to be disruptive when they're a tourist because they're going to be doing things like drinking, they're going to be hanging around their friends, they're going to be they're not exactly on their best behavior, right? Which is really important because these places are advertised sort of as public domain in these advertising campaigns. They are more seen as places where yes, you can go and yes, you can have a good time. Therefore, people are being more likely to drink and actually do things like graffiti or a sacred landmark or something like that. Be more likely to do things that they don't know, that they think that it's just fine because it's public domain. Those things are probably everywhere. It's because these people don't care. They haven't got a reason to care. On their side, that means they're more rude and there's more property damage. On our side, they're less likely to engage in bad behaviors because they know it could lead to incredibly hard outcomes. So proud to affirm.
We thank the first speaker of the affirmative side for their speech, and now I welcome the first speaker of the negating side. Hear, hear.
Hi, I'm just setting up the timer. I'll be speaking in a series. Cool. On our side of the house, we care first and foremost about improving the lives of Indigenous populations. We believe we can manage this in a sensitive and empathetic manner that puts the consent of minorities first. The affirmative team can be high and mighty about moral principles all they like, but we care more about people and what best serves their needs, not vague moralisms that even Indigenous people themselves lack a consensus on. Before I get on to my main substantive, I'd like to rebut a few of the claims that the opposing side has made. Firstly, they've went and run this massive case about how this advertising will be misleading. It'll be wrong. It'll give people a false introduction to these cultures. But in a framing point, I'm going to come out and prove in a second, all of that is just completely false, and the vast majority of the harms they've brought forward simply do not exist on our side of the house. Secondly, they've come out with this, quite frankly, really strange claim that tourists don't want to learn about Indigenous cultures. This is completely and utterly false. Tourists love to, especially tourists visiting Indigenous cultures, love to understand and learn about new cultures around the world. We see tourists, no thank you, as mostly being quite positive and caring about the communities they're going to, seeing them as valuable as they're actually paying money to go experience these communities. And so they want to learn, they want to understand how these things work in reality, and they actually derive a lot of joy and benefit from figuring out how these cultures actually operate. Furthermore, they've responded to our POI about Samoa with just a completely lacking response. They've said that we will not have any way of showing how that money gets from the government to the people. But the fact of the matter is, while it's the government in Samoa advertising these tourism attractions, it's the businesses in Samoa that are actually receiving the money. It's the local communities that are receiving the money. It's more funds coming in from overseas. It's things like Samoan performances being paid for by tourists and local artists receiving a lot of money, and all these other mechanisms that mean that actually it isn't just the government receiving the money, it's everyone receiving the money, and they really should have responded better to this, because they can't just wave away this massive cost to the people of Samoa by just pretending no, it doesn't exist. Furthermore, they've come out with these claims about how in the current system, these racist stereotypes exist and are perpetuated by advertising. But we would say there's a distinct difference between advertising proposed by the free market and companies, which are profit-driven, and advertising by the governments of these nations. There's a very specific difference that I will explain in my point. And I would like to point out that the governments are better because they're not actually fully profit-driven. They're not companies. They actually care about the people. They care about making a difference, and they care about helping those in need. And so, because after that, I'm going to get into a framing point about what actually these advertising things look like and how it actually helps Indigenous cultures, not harms them. We believe what this looks like is, we believe what this advertising would look like is local and international adverts promoting cultures of Indigenous people. An example of this would be something like Do Something New Zealand, having a Maori Ngāi Tahu tourist hotspot in their song, or Indigenous art being shown in posters that are shown around the world. Indigenous people will be promoted every step of the way, looking for an accurate elevation of culture in a respectful manner. We'll get councils of Indigenous people who actually review and put forward their opinions about this advertising and to try to make it as accurate and realistic as possible. We think that this will be full of consultation and consent, and that people will really be looking forward to make this as accurate and as respectful to the cultures as possible. Why is this true? Well, because we're living in the internet age. Today, people are hypersensitive towards unethical behavior
against Indigenous cultures. If these cultures are handled disrespectfully and they air these views to the internet, there will be massive, considerable backlash from tourists that I'll take the POI in a sec, that will reflect badly on the government and hit them with 10 times more harm than the campaign would ever do. And because of this, everything the government would put out would be heavily, heavily scrutinized and be as careful as possible. Local groups would be the main voice in the creation of anything remotely, and anything remotely insensitive is a very, very unlikely to exist because, simply put, the risk of accidentally creating something insensitive like that will massively outweigh the benefits of maybe being able to spin a more exciting story. I'll take your POI now.
Do you think that the culture marketed under the status quo is a fair representation of the culture as a whole?
I would say the cultures advertised by free market businesses might not be a fair representation, but by the government, certainly yes. So after this, let's go and talk about the benefits to Indigenous people. And the first and most, and we're going to bring you two benefits here today. The first and most important one is economic opportunity. Indigenous groups are on the back foot after the plundering of their generational wealth due to the after effects of colonialism. This means that these Indigenous communities tend to have lower incomes, poorer communities, and are missing many basic needs. This looks like, for an example, in Australia, where the Aboriginal communities out in rural areas in their native homelands have bad plumbing, really high child mortality rates, and no good opportunities after the crimes of Australian colonialists. We provide mechanisms to break the cycle of poverty and bring cash into these communities, a material benefit that outweighs anything they could ever bring up. How would we do this? Well, one, we'd say that advertising on the basis of Indigenous culture means that tourists swayed by this advertising will want to be spending their money and holidays discovering and learning more about these cultures. This means that large amounts of tourists, both foreign and local, will be looking to spend their funds on Indigenous experiences. These experiences will be then provided by Indigenous cultures that consent to this commoditization because of the massive economic benefits it will bring to the community. These tourists, we believe, want authenticity, and generally we'd expect these tourists to be well-meaning and intending to learn about the cultures, as this is why they're immersing themselves in these cultures in the first place. And because of this, through both the government directing into Indigenous experiences directly, like in the Do Something New example we've given, or them just being interested in these Indigenous experiences in general, and then finding out about them through Indigenous people advertising their experiences, we can see that these people will be spending their money in the places that need it. This looks like Indigenous artists selling carvings or paintings that are made to tourists, paying for live shows of kapahaka, or people buying tickets to entry of Indigenous land with history of natural wonder, with history there or natural wonders. This means that there will be millions of dollars worldwide entering the pockets of Indigenous people. And the kicker is that Indigenous people consent on every step of the way. This leads to tangible improvements to the people's lives and is something they simply cannot provide. Secondly, just a sub-point about how this elevates Indigenous issues. When countries brand themselves with a focus on those first here, there's very important parts of the discourse and Indigenous and foreign perception of their currency. Indigenous rights is raised to the top of this. So this means that when there's issues like racism and the lingering effects of colonialism, there's big backlash and more backlash under our side of the house than theirs. I see I'm running out of time, but I would like to point out that on our side of the house, we have proved that there's material benefits through finance, and also that all these moral benefits they brought forward have no standing. And because of that, we believe that we should win this debate. Proud to negate. Thank you.
We thank the first speaker of the negating side for that wonderful speech. And now we welcome the second speaker of the affirmative side. Hear, hear.
All right, I'll take POIs in the chat. Two questions in this debate so far. Firstly, why do tourists come to countries in the first place? Secondly, why will this promotion be inherently harmful? And then I'll split on how it can be used by governments to claim racial equality where it doesn't exist. On the first point, why do tourists come to countries? Note that a lot of NEG's material, especially on getting money to Indigenous businesses, is contingent on culture being the sole attractor or a significantly important attractor for people to come to these countries. We tell you three things. Firstly, we tell you that people don't actually come to countries to engage with Indigenous culture, or certainly a large majority of them don't. We think that holiday makers aren't often actually anthropologists. This isn't a main drive for people to come. Secondly, we tell you there are other ways in which to attract people, because these are the reasons that people are attracted in the first place. We tell you that this looks like, having interesting cities. We tell you this looks like having things like landmarks. We tell you this looks like things like beaches. These are the things that people use to promote ourselves. We can see this in New Zealand with our clean green image and with our film industry. We tell you that that's the way that you get people coming to your country. Thirdly, then we tell you this means that this example of Samoa doesn't stand. We tell you that Samoa has plenty of value as a tropical island to get people to come in and to engage with Indigenous businesses because Indigenous people are the majority in Samoa. We tell you that you can get all those benefits on their side without actually commodifying its culture and dumbing it down and trying to attract Western tourists. We tell you this is important because we proved that a lot of the benefits of tourism to countries with Indigenous cultures is entirely symmetric on both sides of the house, but in fact is made better for the stakeholder of Indigenous people on our side because it doesn't rely on harmful representation. We think that that is really, really key because we don't have to see any economic harms on our side whatsoever. Secondly, then, why will this advertising be inherently harmful? Because we saw a point from the negative team about how governments aren't profit-driven, which is what a lot of our material was based on. A couple of responses. Firstly, they absolutely are profit-driven, particularly in this specific industry. Why do tourism companies and agencies, and why does Tourism New Zealand, for example, exist in the first place? It's to promote ourselves to other people, for people to come into our country, to provide revenue for businesses. The reason they exist is for profit, is to make the New Zealand economy stronger. That is the case in every single other country in the world. That's its entire reason for its existence. So we think they're definitely profit-driven there. Bex gave you three reasons to why this was bad. Firstly, she told you that incentives exist to dumb down cultures to make it more advertisable. For example, a lot of Indigenous names are very, very long, and people know that they aren't necessarily going to engage with that. A lot of cultural practices are extremely specific and there's a lot of content to understand around them in order to engage with it respectfully. People aren't necessarily going to engage with that on basic advertising and basic promotional materials. Secondly, she told you that it would change it to make it more entertaining, to make people want to come. We see this with the Hawaiian luau. We see this all the time, which we think is disrespectful to a lot of sacred traditions by making it fun when it's meant to be reverent. Thirdly, we told you that they can engage in stereotypes, for example, of sexualization. We think that harms the image of Indigenous people and their things. We tell you that even if people are drawn to this, even if people are encouraged to come into it with an open mind to engage with these cultural practices, they're going to engage with it in a way that they've been told to by government agencies. They're going to engage in that system, that level of engagement with Indigenous cultures. We tell you that that's super, super harmful to the way that these people are perceived. Before I move on, I will take a POI. All right, okay, I'll simply move on and you can talk to me later. But then moving on to my split on how it can be used by governments to claim racial inequality. Note this is very, very responsive to a lot of their material on why they, on their side of the house, incentivize governments to improve the lives of Indigenous cultures. We tell you that tourism marketing is the way in which countries brand themselves as a nation and to the world. This means the primary exposure of foreigners to this nation and the way it treats Indigenous people is going to be in a promotional poster or an advertisement. B, we tell you that people at home can see their governments doing something very publicly to promote Indigenous culture on the world stage. What does this do? Two things. Firstly, it means that governments can gain a reputation for being progressive abroad because they take time to advertise different ceremonies, to advertise the cultures within them. Even if their policies on discrimination on land towards these Indigenous cultures are actually really, really harmful. We tell you this is especially likely to exist because potential tourists in foreign countries will not be aware of Indigenous issues and the harms of this portrayal or local fights for equality. We see this especially likely, furthermore, in places which have Indigenous cultures, like in Polynesia, like New Zealand and Samoa and Fiji, which don't have that kind of exposure on the world stage and in world media, which don't have people really engaging with its local politics. This then means that racist governments or governments which are directly harmful to their Indigenous people can avoid or escape a lot of international condemnation on being harmful towards their Indigenous people through services like the UN, through services like charities. For example, Scandinavian nations still have a reputation for being extremely progressive, even when they use the Sami people to promote things like the Arctic through the use of igloos and things like that. Secondly, then domestically, governments can point to their harmful promotion of Indigenous culture as proof that they are promoting their culture and they are promoting their rights. We tell you this staves off domestic backlash, especially in the nations which have non-Indigenous majorities, for example, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, who may not actually be educated necessarily in these issues either because they're not going to engage with issues which don't directly affect them. This means that they can get away with not revitalizing language. They can get away with not giving back land title because the image they are projecting, even domestically, is at face value positive towards Indigenous cultures. Why is this harmful? Firstly, because it's entirely performative and doesn't actually do anything. Secondly, it doesn't engage with the real issues that Indigenous people care about. And thirdly, it is proved they're promoting this in a way which is actively harmful, but crucially doesn't look like it is actually harmful. We think that that's particularly key in this debate. I will quickly take a POI before you move on.
In the world in which the government is promoting the majority of their tourism through Indigenous cultures, do you think that the extra hypocrisy of that government then tormenting those Indigenous cultures will lead to 10 times the backlash instead of less?
Look, I've given you material as to why people aren't going to know that it's bad, why foreign tourists aren't going to know anything, why people domestically aren't going to know anything because of the level of that image. Better outcomes on our side, two of them. Firstly, we force governments to do more because they can't rely on their image and avoid backlash on inaction. This is kind of responsive to a lot of their material. Secondly, Indigenous cultures then have to be engaged with on issues that actually matter to them. We see this with systemic racism, with suppression of culture, with language rights. We tell you we get better outcomes on these issues because we actually create the public demand for change because it cannot be mitigated by the government pointing to other things such as their tourism policies or anything else. At the end of this point, we are the side that forces government to actually act, that stops derogatory representation, that risks, that harms Indigenous people. We are so proud to propose.
We thank the second speaker of the affirmative side, and now we welcome the second speaker of the negating side. Hear, hear.
SciDAF's case really confuses me because on the one hand, they seem to think that people are not going to be engaging with these Indigenous cultures. And on the other hand, they claim this massive harm that people are going to be engaging in these Indigenous cultures at mass in a harmful way. They need to pick one. They cannot have both in this debate. What I'm going to do in this speech is prove to you, firstly, that we're going to get massive engagement with like these Indigenous cultures. And then secondly, when they engage with them, the representation is going to be in a good and beneficial way to these individuals. Thirdly, I'll just touch on like the broader stuff about the racial equality and like the damages to like these Indigenous monuments and so forth. Right. Firstly, on the capability for tourists to engage. What we kind of heard from them here was all this material about how tourists are simply not going to engage with like the tourism at hand, and this is just going to be this is generally going to be like a bad thing, as it's just kind of like a waste of money. I've got four kind of responses. Firstly, I just point out this is a direct contention with their like second claim, because insofar as that tourists aren't engaging, you don't actually get negative engagement. So it massively cuts into their capabilities to impact out that harm there. Secondly, we don't actually I'm unsure why it's an issue if people don't actually engage in this debate, because then at our worst case, people don't engage. It's just kind of symmetric, like to both sides of the house. I don't think this material is enough to actually put them above us in this debate, insofar as that both teams just have equal failed engagement. But thirdly, I think that people will actually be engaging with this in a meaningful way for a couple reasons. Firstly, they just find a genuine interest in this, and as a consequence, they find a genuine interest in other cultures, like the history, kind of the learnings of it, and they just have an interest in how other people function. I don't think it's specifically limited to niche anthropologists. I think that most people can actually engage with it and find enjoyment within this stuff. Fourthly, and I think this kind of misses what the debate's about, because the debate is about increasing advertising about these cultural issues. But presumably, if we do get more tourists at net in this debate coming to these places that have these Indigenous cultures, they're going to be coming to actually engage with the Indigenous cultures simply on the grounds that this advertising massively propels it to an international market, shows them that's something that they should be interested in, playing on the massive amount of marketing that the tourism industry kind of has available. The next thing I want to note here is that they kind of make this push that the domestic tourism market is their solution, and they can get enough money towards these communities within the domestic market as a consequence of people engaging at a domestic level. I think there's two reasons for this. Firstly, most people at a domestic level simply don't engage with Indigenous culture because it's not novel, it's not exciting, it's just kind of plain old same old, and they just don't find enjoyment. And secondly, even if they do engage, they simply just do not have enough the similar amount of money and to actually spend on these attractions and actually uplift these communities as opposed to these international tourists really have. Why is it so important that we get more engagement at net on this debate? And I know that it just has to be marginally more engagement on our side of the house to win this debate. We framed our benefits in a couple ways. Firstly, we just told you about the economic benefits, the redistributive nature of most of these tourism operators that actually pay the money back to these individuals within these Indigenous communities and upload them. Secondly, we just told you about cultural acceptance and how it just breaks down indifference barriers between people of different cultures. Thirdly and finally, we just this kind of contends with the material about an international scale. At the point in time that New Zealand is or a nation is specifically marketing the Indigenous culture to the world, they now look like a massive hypocrite if they engage in extremely bad practices against Indigenous people, because they're literally commodifying or using them as a means to generate a lot of profit. Right. Next, let's talk about this representation and what this representation looks like. I think they miss all of our characterization here about how this representation is going to be in a good way because these businesses are predominantly owned by Indigenous individuals. We told you due to things like them being able to provide the most authentic experience and how they have the most tours, they own the land of the tourism sites, and how things such as cancel culture prevent these white businesses from prevailing. And we also said further to this that people probably just generally prefer going to these Indigenous attractions due to the more authentic experiences. So what I think actually happens here is that these cultures, they're going to be owned by Indigenous individuals. They're not going to be going and getting this watered down experience. They're going to get a positive experience, which culturally uplifts them. What else did we hear? We also heard that the government is going to do a bad job of representing what the issue is and actually marketing it. I've got four responses to this. Firstly, and I think we were pretty explicitly in stating this, we're happy to stand for a consultation process to exist between Indigenous groups and the government so that they do a good job of advertising it. They cannot ignore that mechanism, that still stands. Secondly, we tell you that like most governments probably don't want the external perception of being extremely racist and coming across and like commodifying a culture. They're going to do their utmost job to represent it in an interesting way, because the more like authentic and interesting they portray it and less watered down, the more people they probably capture to come to these countries and check out their Indigenous culture due to the general uniqueness of it. Thirdly, we tell you that probably most people don't want to engage with like the racist kind of dumbed down perception. And fourthly and finally, simply because these businesses are owned by minority communities that I previously proved, what this means is that they're doing an accurate advertisement of these businesses and what this industry looks like. Since like minorities and Indigenous people predominantly own these businesses, we get a representative view of what their culture looks like. Right. Next, I want to deal with kind of like this quasi principle we got about how like commodification of these minority groups is harmful. 3 responses. Firstly, we told you that like we're happy to stand for like consent like occurring between Maori groups, insofar as they actually consent to this advertisement occurring and like the discussions occurring. We don't see it massive harm being this commodification of their culture. Secondly, we've shown it's not a cheap representation and not like one that portrays it in a negative way. But thirdly and finally, I actually question whether the governments are the ones engaging in the commodification. Most of the Indigenous groups are the ones that market themselves as a business and create the business embodying their culture. They are not the government is just simply kind of like extrapolating it and like putting a magnifying glass on it. They are not actively commodifying. Those Indigenous groups who like work together to like portray their culture, those are the ones that create the commodification. So I do think consent exists in this debate, and I don't think we have like a special duty in this debate to not uphold, like not do this because it's like commodification, because it's the minorities that actually commodify. Finally, I want to say, even if the engagement is harmful, why are we still here in this debate? 2 reasons. Firstly, it's just still some engagement, and it serves to break down a degree of cultural like indifference. Say, for example, like a white tourist comes to New Zealand, at least now they can like go a tiny bit and experience new cultures. Even if it's like a bad representation, they can go a long way in just becoming appreciative of how different things are, even if it's extremely watered down, and they can start to break down their indifference barriers with other races. And secondly, we still get this massive economic benefit, like them buying merchandise, them like engaging with these businesses owned by like local iwi and so forth. That is still a massive benefit, even if the engagement is at net harmful. Finally, onto the material about like what this means broader. The claim we kind of got here was that it's like going to damage like these the claim we kind of got here was that it's going to damage like these minority like landmarks which are of cultural significance. I thought this was ridiculous for 3 reasons. Firstly, this is like largely symmetric because presumably people are going to be like still being drunk in their world and like still like knocking these like monuments over. But the key difference is that the extra tourists that we get in our world are now coming to check out the cultural authenticity of these things, and they're generally going to be more respectful and like not engaged with it. Secondly, we just say that like most of these sites are probably protected, they're probably UNESCO heritage, they're probably not in public and going to be easily destroyed. Finally, on this stuff about like the claims, like finally on the stuff about like how it creates like a fake perception of international, like racial equality. 4 responses. Firstly, we say that most people engaging with this advertising as an international audience. Therefore, most people domestically are not actually being actively tricked by the government into thinking that the government's doing a good job, because they never see the ads on TV, they never see like the advertisements on the website, and they can never like actually draw that connection that they're doing a good job. Secondly, if it is blatantly racist, it's probably going to overflow and like make a massive deal, reach international media, and come back to people in New Zealand, and they'll start to care about it as well. Thirdly, we tell you that just like generally people are becoming like, thirdly, we tell you that probably most people just simply view this as a drop in the bucket and are not going to like view it as like them definitively solving all these cultural issues. They're going to want to fight for more. So I think we're quite ahead in this debate insofar as that we prove that people engage with it and the engagement is positive and there's no broader societal harms. Incredibly proud to negate.
We thank the second speaker of the negating side for that wonderful speech, and now I welcome the third speaker of the affirmative side. Hear, hear.
Okay, and just like everyone else, I would prefer POIs in the chat, please. And is my sound all good? Cool. On our side of the house, we think it's more important to hold up the values of Indigenous people rather than the pockets of the tourism industry. We may lose tourism, but we gain back respect, which is important to upholding the longevity of the culture in its purest form. 3 points of clash today. How culture tourism is harmful on their side of the house and we mitigate the risks of it on ours. Secondly, how tourism affects the economic sides of countries and how primary source incomes affect this as well. And thirdly, why the government incentive is not enough to uphold Indigenous representation. Firstly, how culture tourism is harmful on their side. We heard a lot about how even if it was watered down, it would still be beneficial for these tourists to get a simple taste of this culture. We don't think that this is valuable in this debate. We think that if they're traveling to a country for the tourism, they're going to want the richest side of it, which happens on our side of the house, as we've told you. One, because there's no profit-driven incentive. The people that want to go to learn about the culture will, as I'll talk about later. Two, the people hosting these events and tourism-fueled activities will be more inclined to make it deep and meaningful and less watered down to ensure that they get, to ensure that they get more profit on their side. The main thing that they told us was that the types of engagement that we get on both sides of the house are somatic. We don't think this is true. We think that many of the tourisms that are going to go to these places to engage in the cultural and Indigenous aspects will not be incentivized to do so due to an ad that they saw on TV. They will already be interested in these things and they will be going of their own account. Therefore, this kind of falls away within the debate and it doesn't really hold any real weighting on their side, only when we think of it as who is going to be responding to this cultural appropriation that in many cases is outlined on these government incentivized advertisements. When we told you that tourists actually don't want to engage with this culture, you didn't engage with any of our MECs to do with this. Learning about a culture is hard, and only when you really want to do it are you going to get the most deep and meaningful side to it, which we think is really, really important. We don't want to just engage on the surface level of these cultures. We want to be deep and meaningful about it, and we want to know everything. We choose to focus these tourist attractions on the people who actually do instead of the people who don't. Okay, one. Why is this tourism actually more consumable? One, it's easier to remember. Two, it's usually the most interesting parts. Like we told you at Bex and Jack's, this is going to be what draws people in, and again, they're going to be a little bit disappointed when it's not what they saw on the back of the postcard. Why is this harmful? One, a culture is being misrepresented, right? They're not going to have all their culture in all its glory actually advertised in a way if it's profit incentivized. When it is whitewashed to a certain extent in which it is dumbed down, they are less inclined to go deeper. They hit the surface level and stop there. Like in the example we gave you at the lays given out in Hawaiian airports. This is not an equal representation of absolutely everything, right? And again, like I've told you, the people that are going to see these things will want to be interested anyway. Lastly, in this point of clash about drunk tourists, we do think that they hold quite an important stake in this debate because it really shows kind of the disrespect that many of these tourists have. If they're not going for the culture, they're not going to want to engage in any of the culture like we gave you multiple MECs and multiple analysis for. Therefore, this is actually symmetric on both sides. Although when they're incentivized to go to enjoy the culture, they're more likely to have respected these places and etc. Secondly, on how does tourism actually affect the economic sides of the country, the primary source and the primary source incomes? They told us massively that they would lose out on a massive primary income of money. Might I remind you that COVID-19 is still actually a thing, and this closed a lot of borders within every single country in the world, and which meant tourism was completely flat. They did not absolutely falter during this time, in which they actually had to be more self-sufficient without tourism. We saw this all over the world. We saw this in New Zealand, in which many cases you become more of a local market. You advertise your things within your community. Therefore, we can see how they can actually survive without this massive tourism. And as I said in my introduction, we value upholding the culture more than we do upholding the amounts of money that will be going into these places. And secondly, on where is this money actually going? They told us a lot about the communities that would be putting on these businesses, but we can see when someone sees an opportunity to make money, they're going to take it. And this is not always the people that actually need it most. The people who need it, no, thank you. The people who need it are not always going to be getting this money. They told us that there was a redistribution and that will just go back out. They never really told us much about this, except that it was Indigenous people running these stalls, in which we told you that they can just as likely advertise that within their own community, and therefore doesn't need the government to advertise tourism to the wider society and wider international world. Lastly, on domestic tourism, this is more actually focusing on within your own country before assessing the wider world. We believe that in a country, it is more valuable for the people within that country to know the deep and meaningful past within it, than focusing on countries. Now I'll take a POI if you have one.
As a tourist to New Zealand, would you rather go to a Maori Indigenous experience run by a local iwi as opposed to like some white person?
I'm not quite sure how that engages with our material. I would most likely rather it go to a Māori because they know far more about the culture, but I feel as though that within these types of situations, if you're going to be going to these things, you're going to want to know about the culture, and therefore you would rather the actual culture that we're promoting on our side of the house, unlike the whitewashed version you're trying to push on tourists on your side of the house. Finally, and lastly, very quickly, on the government incentives and how the government incentives are not actually ones that uphold Indigenous values within our community. They told us that governments aren't profit driven, which was simply laughable. Through taxes, through people actually coming into the country and spending their money here, we can see how they most definitely do profit off tourists coming into New Zealand. We told you with Jack that Tourism NZ is a massive example of this. We wouldn't have these institutions if it did not make more money. Therefore, they jump at a chance to make more things advertisable within our communities. Secondly, they told us this model of councils of Indigenous people, it will be respectful. We kind of have to think of the characterization. They're still going to be wanting this money, so why would they not do this? This council will be made up of white people that will be promoting this government whitewashed version of tourism. And then they tried to come back and say that it will be in consent with iwi, etc. We can see how this doesn't always hold up. Therefore, this completely falls down on their side of the house. And this is so important to uphold the longevity of cultures in the world. Thank you.
We thank the third speaker of the affirmative side for that wonderful speech, and now we welcome the third speaker of the negating side to close the substantive portion of this debate. Hear, hear.
Just POIs in the chat, please. Can I start when ready? Can I start? Okay. I think I'll do three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain why most of side F's analysis completely missed the mark in this debate. Then secondly, I'll be exploring why tangible benefits are the most important thing in this debate to these Indigenous communities. Then I'll be dealing with the point of clash. I think the debate generally boils down to one point of clash, what most benefits minorities. And then I'll sort of be dealing with that quite weak principle claim they came out at first at. Okay, first, just general response on why their analysis completely marked. First of all, they completely ignored the motion that specified advertisement throughout most of their first speaker's speech, insofar as that they're talking about the government like directly exploiting these businesses. This isn't a harm, since the government will be engaging in advertising. They aren't going to be directly profiting out of these businesses. Secondly, they ignored our model completely, which I think we ran right down our line from Ethan, that said that like these Indigenous improved advertisements, which basically means that all their harms about misrepresentation or whatever will be removed. No, thank you on the POI. Thirdly, they completely ignored our characterization that these are mainly Indigenous-owned businesses. They said that they'll be whitewashed. Why are Indigenous-owned businesses, who are typically very proud and very patriotic people about their culture, be watering down their businesses? Fourthly, they never mechanized out why representation is different on their side of the house. They needed to do this to win, since that was like their primary claim. I would say that Indigenous, that representation is more likely to be whitewashed on their side of the house, since they don't have this great free advertising from the government we stand for. So they'll need to like try that, like if we accept all their characterization, they need to try and like make it sort of be more attractive and whitewash it down. Yeah. So I think based on this, most of their analysis is like completely off. But now I'm going to be explaining why tangible benefits are the most important thing. I think to win this debate, the burden SciDAF needed to prove was to show that no tangible benefits translated as a result of the implementation of this motion, because tangible benefits are the core of our case, and they are the most important thing we're proving. Okay, why are tangible benefits the most important thing? Firstly, tangible benefits actually solve the issues in these historically marginalized communities, such as poverty, such as lack of access to like medical equipment and whatever. Secondly, tourism draws attention to these issues. This is like a further indirect benefit that we get when we're advertising these cultures in these expansive marketing schemes. We get this attention to these issues at the point in time people are now visiting these cultures. Thirdly, I think we just say that like the majority of like this outrage or whatever, it doesn't actually matter insofar as that we're actually benefiting the communities. I don't think people are going to be mad, and on the off chance that the government like makes a slightly offensive advertisement or something. I think it doesn't matter insofar as that we now have these people who are like historically marginalized getting food and getting money from these businesses. Okay, now to deal with the point of clash, benefits to minorities. Okay, I think we really outlined our case quite well, and we preempted most of their like racism material in our model, which they just completely ignored for some reason. Secondly, I think we outlined economic, cultural, and international awareness benefits that are like exclusive to our side of the case, since we have these extensive advertising schemes. I think we only really got one response to our economic benefits, which was F saying that the money isn't going to communities. I think Ethan outlined really well about how like Indigenous communities like Ngāi whatever reimburse the money they get from their businesses into the community. And once again, they completely missed the mark on motion. It's the government is advertising, not selling these businesses. And thirdly, I think we just get direct economic benefit insofar as that now shopping at Indigenous businesses, companies buying Indigenous products, and that like these businesses now expanding and employing more Indigenous people. I think because of this, we've shown a clear financial benefit. I've already outlined why this is the most important issue in the debate. This is top level analysis, since it shows solves the actual issues instead of virtue signaling. And I think we win this debate alone, and anything further is margin widening. I'll quickly take the POI now.
Why do we see the same stereotypes of cultures like Hawaiian women if people go to these nations for real engagement?
I think we don't see these same stereotypes, since it is, instead of like these businesses advertising, it's now the government who are going to be like really socially sensitive, since it is the government instead of like a oppressive business that's run by white people. It's now the government and these like approved advertisements, like we said in our model, like we've said through every single one of our speeches, that is approved by these communities. And yeah, Okay, now onto the first point of clash. I think crucially, all their analysis once again missed the mark, since they assumed like all these tourists and whatever are really naive and racist without the appropriate mechanisms, and most of this characterization was generally a stretch. Okay, now onto this historical oppression point. I think with widely publicized oppression in countries like Australia and whatever of these Indigenous communities, I think the government on our side of the house will do more work to mend this insofar as that's widely publicized and they need to make a great effort to repair this. Okay, now to this misrepresentation and westernization point. Once again, we dealt with this sufficiently in modeling. And I think further to this, authenticity is valued to the travelers who are engaging with this. And the people who are like engaging with this cultural stuff, they're like really keen to see these cultures and whatever. Now onto commodification. Why isn't this commodification? Okay, first of all, we've got this Indigenous consent and these businesses that are Indigenous owned, like we've said, right down our line, never engaged with. All the impacts here stand. Okay, secondly, it's even if commodification does occur, it's unlikely to be extensive because of these cancel culture mechanisms, because the government is generally aware the government is not going to be making offensive ads. It's just completely wrong for them to just assert this. And then thirdly, even at their biz case, I think we can stand by some commodification insofar as that we provide societal and economic benefits to these people with the result of the implementation of this process. And then now to deal with this destruction of property stuff, we say, why is this not happening on your side? There's going to be drunk people on your side of the house as well. No, thank you to that POI. Secondly, I tell you it's more likely to happen on your side of the house since we don't have these massive advertisement campaigns explaining how important these cultural monuments are. And thirdly, just like Tom said, there'll be security at these things. They aren't going to leave like this massively important like Hawaiian sculpture or something unguarded. And then I think we say most people just engage with this in good faith anyway. They aren't going to actively try and destroy important thing of culture. And then at their second speech, they tried to be really sneaky and claim all our benefits by saying people are going to come anyway and like this won't have anything. And they said that like they can pay for advertising on their side of the house. I think they can't really say this since these like Indigenous groups have limited capital. As such, advertising will take away from the profit. So they can either have advertising and have people coming and reduce profit, and they cannot address the issues, or they cannot have people coming and the addressers aren't addressed anyway. That was a really sneaky thing to try and do. And then secondly, they said, why is the government important to achieve this awareness? I think the government has greater reach, the best interests at heart. They have the financial capability to do this. And fourthly, there's less hoops to jump through for the government. And then secondly, they said that like Samoa, these people are coming anyway for the cultural stuff. I think in many countries like the USA and Australia, people aren't coming to see Indigenous cultures. So the benefits in these countries are marginal. And often these countries have the worst historical treatment of Indigenous groups. So I think overall here, even oh, and just to deal with this COVID stuff, businesses did not survive. I can't believe I even have to address this COVID stuff. And now just onto the principle quickly. I think the principle is really weak in the point in time. They still stand for commodification through the marketing of the culture, like they said at second speaker. But I think it's just with no real benefits, as I outlined before, the government advertising is essential. So I think overall, even at their absolute best, where people are engaging in bad faith, I think we still win because we see the tangible benefits, which I've explained, are so good, so proud to affirm. Negate.
We thank the third speaker, the negating side, for that wonderful speech. And now, as is customary, we will flip the sides. And now I welcome the negating reply. Hear, hear.
Two assertions underpin SIDAF's case, and their failure to prove any of them to be true costs in the debate. Firstly, they asserted to the fact that governments will represent these minority groups in negative ways. And then secondly, they asserted that these businesses are not owned by Indigenous groups, but instead they are owned by profit-driven capitalists. We never heard any meaningful structural reasoning as to why this is the case and why these assertions are true. We heard a few one-liners which we kicked out of this debate, and I think their case is basically premised on these two things being true. Insofar as they don't prove it, they lose this debate. I'm going to chat about three things. Firstly, what this representation looks like. secondly, why we get more engagement, and then thirdly, talking more about the broad societal stuff. Firstly, about what this representation looks like. We were pretty explicit in explaining why these Indigenous like cultural experiences are by and large owned by like Indigenous people. We gave you 3 reasons. Firstly, it's generally more authentic if it's owned by like an Indigenous individual. They understand the culture, they understand how to best represent it to others. Secondly, they simply own the land rights in most of these Indigenous interactions due to their like sacred like value, and therefore they exclusively can like operate these tourism ventures here. Thirdly, we told you that there's probably a degree of cancel culture operating insofar as a white tourist business owner owns these businesses. The only response we got to this was the response to a POI we asked, whether tourists are more likely to go to a business owned by an Indigenous person or a white person. To this, they said that people are more likely to go to a business owned by an Indigenous people, which basically concedes to the fact that tourists are more likely to want to go to these Indigenous-owned businesses, making it impossible for any of these white-owned businesses that are unauthentic and do a poor representation to ever make a sizable change within the market. Why is this so important? I think there's 2 reasons. Firstly, we gave you all of the impacting about why that provides like economic benefits to these minority cultures and like the economic benefits, and also like the general cultural benefits of this awareness. But secondly, as like these businesses are representations of what the tourism industry looks like for like Indigenous experiences, this is what the advertisement would look like, because the advertisement is basically a reflection of the culture. So insofar as we prove that to be true, it's highly unlikely that minorities, like the government, is going to be painting it in a bad faith way. But further to this, we believe that there is reason to believe that the government isn't going to paint it in a bad faith way. We gave you 2 reasons. Firstly, they just simply don't want to appear racist, appear colonialistic due to the backlash. And then secondly, we tell you that authenticity is a point of difference. And if you want to set yourself apart from like other areas with different cultural groups, simply by marketing your unique like culture that people can experience and check out, you completely remove any of those benefits insofar as you water it down, make it inauthentic and kind to whitewash it. But even if this is like not the case, we tell you that people can like even if the government representation is still bad, we believe that people are still likely to come, but just because like the perception from the advertising is whitewash, they can still engage with like the representation in a good way, because all of these businesses are owned by Indigenous individuals. So I think we're ahead on representation. Next, on engagement. I thought this was a low energy point because it doesn't actually matter much in this debate, because we only have to prove that we get marginally more people engaging to really come ahead on this. And because we proved that it's going to be largely positive, and we can get net more engagement, we claim all of our benefits at a comparative wider margin. We told you that because of we told you we're going to get like more engagement because of 2 reasons. Firstly, the unique opportunities that the government advertising provides to advertise like your unique businesses, unique outreach it has that these individual companies cannot have. And then secondly, we told you that domestic tourism is largely symmetric and it's probably not enough to sustain these businesses. In terms of impacting, it's pretty important for why this engagement matters, simply because we get more economic benefits and more cultural exception on these issues. Finally, about these broader issues within society. They kind of dropped this at third, and I think that was a good thing because it didn't really matter that much in the debate. But further to this, 3 responses. Firstly, we told you that because of the cultural acceptance increasing, we can largely like weigh off this marginal harm that may occur. Secondly, we told you that domestically people do not engage with this whitewashing advertisement, therefore it's very hard for this whitewashing to actually occur in a meaningful amount. And thirdly, we just believe that if it is so bad, it simply overflows and there is backlash occurring. So I think at the end of this, we win on all 3 clashes in this debate. We get more engagement, we get more representation, and we get a broader appeal to cultural issues in society. So proud to stand on team representation in this debate.
We thank the negating reply speaker, and now to close out this debate, we welcome the affirming reply. Hear, hear.
Three contentions in this debate today. Firstly, why will this inherently be harmful representation? Secondly, how will tourists engage with Indigenous culture? And thirdly, on economic benefits. On the first point, we told you that tourism campaigns are made by the government by nature. Any other actors brought forward by NEG on this doesn't stand in this debate. Why then will it inherently be harmful? We gave you 4 reasons for this. Firstly, we told you that governments don't exactly have a great history on being respectful towards Indigenous cultures. We think there's probably going to be a certain level of ignorance that exists. Secondly, there is an incentive to simplify cultural practices to make them attractive to potential tourists, even if Indigenous people are consulted in the decision-making process. Because it means it's far more easily marketable not to include a bunch of really a lot of context about how it's really how to respect it properly. But B, Bex told you that promotional material actually looks like posters and 30-second ads. We tell you that, and told you before, that important cultural context is probably going to be missed by necessity simply through the medium in which this exists. Third reason was that because they will also market them to be more entertaining, to make people actually engage with this. We think that's definitely going to misrepresent practices at best. And fourthly, we told you that governments can use it to improve their international reputation without enacting real change. What was next principal pushback on this? They told us it was about how governments don't want to be seen being racist. They have an incentive not to engage in harmful stereotypes. This doesn't actually engage with any of my material at second about how foreign tourists and many domestic citizens aren't actually aware of the local issues to call that out, to recognize that, to have that backlash, especially in the case of smaller nations like the examples that were brought forward continuously from NEG, such as Samoa, such as New Zealand. This point is super, super important because it shows that Indigenous people will have practices that are very significant to them, very valuable, very sacred to be debased. We think we should value this point highly in this debate, and we think it falls to us. Secondly, then, how will tourists engage with culture? We told you that firstly, people don't go to given nations to engage with Indigenous cultures. They only will in instances which are seen as entertaining, which we've already given you, we told you several times, is going to be inherently disrespectful, is going to be wrong. But secondly, we told you even if they do engage with it, even if they do go to Indigenous owned businesses, which do portray it respectfully and accurately, they won't act respectfully during it because their perception of the ceremony is wrong, simplified, or a stereotype, because that's what's been sold to them in these marketing campaigns. This is important in this debate because it shows that NEG don't get their benefits on more engagement with Indigenous cultures, because either it doesn't exist at all, or it is harmful and far worse even if we get less representation, which is actually good, which is actually respectful to these Indigenous cultures. Thirdly and finally then, on economic benefits. Firstly, we told you that we value accurate cultural representation far more in this debate, especially when we had unresponded to material about how governments are incentivized to make real change for Indigenous people because they can't use promotion as a facade of progressiveness. We didn't see this mentioned by their second or third once. We think that this is really key material here. We think they dropped the ball with that one. But furthermore, we tell you the success of tourism isn't contingent on people using Indigenous culture as a draw, also unresponded to, also get material given at second. We tell you there are other draws which are actually going to be representative of the nation and will attract people just as much. People aren't limited to what their Indigenous cultures are. We think there are more other ways in which they can market themselves, which are going to get just as many tourists and just as many economic benefits on our side of the house. We tell you that local businesses and local Indigenous owned businesses get money no matter what. We don't think at this point did anything at all for Canterbury. So what do we have at the end of this debate? We say that tourists won't engage with culture properly. We tell you that they don't get any economic benefits on their side. We tell you that this representation is going to be inherently harmful. Proud to stand for the actual side of representation. Thank you.
We thank both teams for a wonderful debate. Now I'm about to turn off the stream. You can take a second to say bye to the wonderful audience. And you may cross the floor and, I don't know, virtually high five.
Yo,